right? Isaiah 61, let's call this one All Who See, coming from a quote that appears roughly at the middle or in the middle of the passage, but is super similar to another quote we'll see toward the end of the passage in this chapter that I think may roughly break down into 4 sections this time. The first one seeming to talk about the Christ, understanding it's one that Christ himself is going to quote in his ministry, I believe, specifically in Luke. The second section seeming to talk about his people. The third section seeming to talk about God. And then the final section seeming to talk about his prophet, this time presumably Isaiah. But that first section running from verses 1 through 3, famously starting in verse 1, the Spirit of the Lord God is upon me because he has anointed me to do a number of things. First and foremost, bring, then to proclaim, then to comfort and to grant. But breaking each of those down a little bit further, to bring good news to the poor. I skipped over to bind up the brokenhearted, to proclaim liberty to the captives and the opening the opening of the prison to those who are bound. Verse 2, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor, the day of vengeance of God, to comfort all who mourn. Verse 3, to grant to those who mourn in Zion, and instead of contrast in a number of ways. First of all, to give them a beautiful headdress instead of ashes, gladness instead of mourning, praise instead of a faint spirit, that they may be called oaks of righteousness. That theme, righteousness, appearing once again. It's going to appear at least 3 times in this chapter, as well as the second section is going to go on to describe his people, going roughly from verses 4 through 7, talking about the way in which they will rebuild in verse 4, aided by the strangers and foreigners sojourning among them who will serve them in many capacities. In verse 6, talking about the way in which, once again, this time they will eat the wealth of the nations. In verse 7, going on to talk about the way in which all of this is going to basically take the shape of them not simply oppressing foreigners, but the way in which those nations who have typically oppressed them will then come to them in service. Once again, like I said, verse 7, flipping their shame into joy, specifically describing the way in which they will enjoy a double portion, presumably of blessings, and even better than the blessings materially, as we talked about in the last chapter, they shall have everlasting joy at the end of verse 7. Verses 8 and 9, however, going on to talk about, as we mentioned, the Lord, talking about the way in which he specifically loves justice. And even more than that, he hates robbery and wrongdoing. Verse 9, talking about the way in which all who see them shall acknowledge. Thus our title. Thus acknowledge what? I'm sorry. Will acknowledge that they are offspring of the Lord who have been blessed. The final section of the chapter, as we mentioned, presumably talking about Isaiah, who will say, I will greatly rejoice in the Lord, for he has clothed me with the garments of salvation. He has covered me with robes of, once again, righteousness. Verse 11 going on to say, for as the earth brings forth its sprouts, and as a garden causes what is sown in it to sprout up, so the Lord will cause, once again, righteousness and praise to sprout up before all the nations. Thus, the title that we pulled from verse 9 seems to reappear here, at least in some form, in verse 11, reminding me of what we saw during the days of King David and Solomon, understanding the way in which he used Israel as a light to the nations, then as a physical kingdom that was ascending during the days of David to what it would apparently become in the days of Solomon, the greatest nation on earth. One, as we are reminded once again here in the prophet Isaiah, was to be one put on display as a nation exemplifying righteousness, reminding me of this. That when you look at a display window, it is typically, if it's a reputable business, it is one that is trying to put its best foot forward, showing you the best of what it has to offer. But a quality business likewise will typically understand that what it has on display means a whole lot less if what it has in stock is lacking. And so God seems to be, through Isaiah, helping us to see once again that God is not simply blessing Israel and likewise even today his people in vain. He is blessing them so that all may see what he is trying to do in creating a place of perfection. And even though he has not called his people to be perfect on their own, what he has called them to do is to at least reach for perfection. And in doing that, more than simply displaying the quality of a person or the quality of his people, he really seems to be displaying the quality of his process, where he takes us faulty people and he turns us into something that everyone can genuinely feel comfortable putting on display.